Hi there, Alex here. I know I don't really make a lot of videos and I barely talk about basketball ever, but I just finished watching the Phoenix Suns play the Denver Nuggets, and there's a couple of things that I wanted to talk about that relate to basketball broadly in general as a sport and the basic concepts that you can learn from this kind of game. So I don't really have a format for this, but the Suns lost to the Nuggets 130 to 26, despite being far in the lead after the first half, and it looked like the Suns had it locked up. The Nuggets led when it was 2-0, but they didn't have another lead until the fourth quarter. That's how much of a lead the Suns had going into halftime. The game went into overtime, and the Nuggets just took over. They swarmed. So there's three things that I want to talk about specifically, and I'll get to that. The three things I want to talk about are regression to the mean, two-dimension offenses, and play-to-play decision making. These things, I think, are what really caused a difference for the Suns between the first and second half and why they blew such a lead. So first off, I want to talk about regression to the mean. So this is generally a concept in statistics, but it can be applied in basketball as well. Regression to the mean essentially means that when you have some sort of average trend line, you're generally going to follow that average trend line. If you have something that overshoots it or undershoots it drastically, you can expect that eventually you'll get back to that same trend line. And this is mostly true when it comes to basketball. So if you have a player that's really hot, say they're shooting really well, and I want to use the direct example of Mikal Bridges, right? Mikal Bridges was shooting 6 for 6 from three-point line in the first half. 100% three-point shooting is not something that can be counted on like per average. Usually at the NBA level, you can count at about 40% is about what an average three-point shooter will be shooting. So there's kind of two directions you can take this. If you have a player that's really hot, it is a fallacy to shut them down. I had a coach in high school that told one of my teammates who shot 8 for 8 in the second quarter to stop shooting because that kind of streak will end. And yes, that's true. However, when it comes to human emotions and it comes to human psychology, flow is the game, right? So if you have a player that's hot, you want to keep them in the flow. And the Suns, unfortunately, weren't able to keep that up in the second half. So I don't think it was a bad decision. It's not like they kept trying to feed Mikal Bridges or DeAndre Ayton, who were having very good first halves, and they just crashed to regression of the mean. But what really happened was, overall as a team, they had this stellar over the mean kind of performance and crashed far below it, averaging out to a middle medium and kind of causing them to panic. I think one of the biggest indicators of this, if you go back, is watching Chris Paul in the second half. In the first half, he was making a lot of really good passes, crisp, clean, great assists, very good vision, and one of the better passers you're going to ever see in the NBA. And that's just who he is. He's going to be a Hall of Famer. Great. But in the second half, it just wasn't happening. There was that regression of the mean. 13 assists in the first half, 1, 2 in the second half. 15 assists is a great performance in a game, but again, regression to the mean. So when you're in a basketball game, you have to recognize this, right? So you can generally expect there to be a regression to the mean, and if there's this super hot performance and it crashes down to the ground, you can't expect that hot performance to be back immediately. What you need to do is create a safe environment for it to be an average performance after that if there's a crash. And the Suns didn't really do that. They kept trying to make these gambling plays that were really working out in the first half, but in the second half, they just weren't there in the same capacity. So rather than taking a lot of safe options to conserve their very considerable lead, they made a lot of errors that really didn't need to be made because they're trying to recapture that same spark that had in the first half, which I don't blame them. It was an exciting spark, but generally the rule that you need to follow is that that kind of spark is rare, and if you can get it, keep it as long as you possibly can, but if it's gone, you need to make decisions to create parameters that crash can be safe, right? So I think that's the first thing that the Suns did wrong in the second half was not creating a safe environment for their players that were really hot in the first half that crashed in the second half. And that's not to discredit the Nuggets. They played a good defensive game. The first half and second half, they played a good defensive game. But I think in the next segment, where I'm talking about two-dimension offense, is really the difference between the first and second half when it comes to the defense of the Nuggets. So I want to introduce this concept of, I don't know the real terms for it, but I call it two-dimension offense versus one-dimension offense. So the Suns in the first half really had a very good two-dimension offense. And what I mean by that is a two-dimension offense is one that's able to utilize the entire side of the court on your offensive possessions rather than just focusing on going towards the basket, right? So a way that you can look at it is the difference between soccer and American football movement. You notice in soccer that a lot of the times, even though they're going to a singular goal, a lot of the times they're going to be moving backwards, laterally, or diagonally, and not really going towards the goal immediately. Whereas in American football, every single play that you do has to go forward. There is an essence of some lateral movement, but essentially relying on lateral movement and going backwards aren't really going to get you anywhere, especially within the constraints of the rules. So in basketball, this is a transferable concept because one-dimension offenses are ones that focus directly on movement towards the basket. It works a lot of the time, but when speaking from a basketball perspective, it is an older type of offense. It's difficult to get away from it, but you can notice teams really focus on going towards the basket rather than utilizing all of the space available to them. In the first half in particular, the Suns had a two-dimensional offense, which means that they were able to open up the floor. So rather than really focusing on going straight to the basket, there was a lot of movement to the sides, a lot of movement to the wings, and using all of the space that was available, using some of the mid-range areas to kind of spread some movement away from the paint. Sorry, I couldn't think of the name of the paint. And basically being able to spread the defense out. So as a defense, you're naturally supposed to play underneath the offenders. But if there's this two-dimensional offense, all of a sudden you have to try and play almost like a pseudo zone to be able to make sure that there's nothing really coming in front of you, behind you, to the side of you. It's a more difficult job, but players of this caliber can keep up with it, and that's why the Suns didn't score 200 points. If you want a really good example of a team that ran a great two-dimension offense, you can watch highlights from the 2019 Washington Mystics. They had a very good two-dimension offense, and it's indicative with the performances they had. They had a record-breaking offense, and that's really why. So what does that mean for the context of this particular game? So in the first half, like I said, the Suns had a two-dimension offense, and the Nuggets very much had a one-dimension offense, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that at all, especially when you have the players of that caliber. You're not going to really have an issue, right? If I were to try and play a one-dimension offense against the Denver Nuggets, I would have a bad time because I'm not a basketball player of that caliber. However, when you have players like Nikola Jokic, you have Gary Harris, etc. I don't know the Nuggets, but what are their names? But yeah, when you have players that are NBA caliber, you can do a one-dimension offense. You just have to create the parameters and circumstances that are good for your team to have. However, the Phoenix Suns were able to effectively use a two-dimension offense, which opens up the floor much more and shows why they were able to have much more success both in the paint and from three-point line in the first half. That's how you open up the game. There's almost a symbiotic relationship between the paint and three-point line. However, in the second half, they weren't able to have that same functionality. They kind of regressed back into this one-dimensional offense, kind of using wings and corners and mid-range as shot opportunities rather than spacing opportunities, and those are different. Even though they took a lot of threes in the first half, it very much was a matter of spacing rather than just, oh, we need a shot, guess he's open from three, shoot it. It was more a matter of, we have all of these players who are able to shoot from any spot on the floor, and look, there's the space that we created on offense, get it there. In the second half, that wasn't there. So all of a sudden you have the situation where you're not as hot as you were in the first half, and your offense is one-dimensional, which means that the Denver Nuggets have an opportunity to get back in this game. They're playing the same game they played in the first half. The Suns have to figure out what they're doing now. That was a lot of the difference going into the second half. I know that was kind of rambly, but basically the Nuggets were able to, throughout the entire game, play the same offense they were playing the entire game, play the same defense they were playing the entire game, but the Suns were all of a sudden on their heels in the second half because they weren't able to really create that same spacing in two dimensions like they were in the first half. Which brings me to my third point, and I want to talk about play-to-play decision-making. And this is a lot of the reason why these kind of things fell apart in the second half. So everything that happens on the court is a decision, whether it's a decision of the coach or of a player or even of a referee, right? All of these things that happen are decisions. And what happened in this game was a shift from very smart decision-making in the first half from the Phoenix Suns to not smart decision-making in the second half. And that's where it ultimately fell apart. Where I talk about hot and cold streaks and one dimension versus two dimension offenses, a lot of these things that happened were errors on behalf of the Suns, not because they're bad basketball players, but because they had poor decision-making skills, right? So you have to recognize where you're hot and where you're cold. Chris Paul kept shooting from mid-range. He's a great basketball player, but he was not hitting them from mid-range tonight. So you have to create other opportunities. You had a lot of assists in the first half. You had a lot of three-point shots in the first half. They kept trying to force these things all of a sudden, instead of what happened in the first half was it coming naturally from good decision-making and very conscious decision-making when it came to spacing. In the second half, they didn't have these conscious decisions and made a lot of mistakes that would be made by somebody very young in the league or somebody that's inexperienced in basketball. Like, a lot of the forcing things would be something I would do, something that somebody that's not very smart when it comes to playing on the basketball court would do. And on the other side of the court, like I said, with the Nuggets, it was consistency. I'm not saying that they played ultimately a better game than the Suns, or the Suns played a bad game, but the Nuggets were able to create the same decisions over and over again. They essentially created a game where they could do the same thing, possession in, possession out, possession in, possession out. That has great benefits and great consequences. If eventually you end up scoring more points, then you'll win. But if you're not making adjustments in situations where it's dire, all of the sudden your team doesn't look so good. However, in this game, it worked out perfect for them. They were able to make the same consistent decisions, possession in on offense, possession out on defense, and were able to eventually keep chunking away at the lead until it was time to go, or tied going into the end of regulation. So yeah, that's all I have to say about tonight's Nuggets and Suns game. I know it's not really a lot, and I didn't use a lot of specific examples. Devin Booker got hurt, so he couldn't play in overtime, and that basically would hurt the Suns' chances a lot, especially when it comes to spacing. He's a good outside and mid-range shooter. So what are you gonna do? You can't, injuries happen. And I think they play tomorrow, so you don't want to hurt your guy. But yeah, anyway, that's all I wanted to say about it. Just if you're into basketball, and you want to take a look for yourself, watch this game, Nuggets versus Suns, January 22nd, 2021. It was a pretty good game, but keep in mind that every single game has decisions, and you can learn from it. So, thanks for watching, and let me know if you totally disagree with anything I'm saying or add anything. I'd love to start a conversation. Thanks. Bye.